welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host today, and I'm here with a really fun book. This book will appeal to fantasy fans, but it will also appeal to, I think, people who like something just a little bit different in their books. Somebody who, maybe looks at certain tropes and wants something else out of them. I loved it. I think the most recent book that it made me think a little bit of was Assisted to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. I think that this book is almost like, they could probably be like cousins or something. The tone and the characters, I think that they would all have a lot to talk about. So please introduce yourself and tell us about Dreadful.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Rozakis, and the way that I've been describing Dreadful is it features an evil wizard who has lost his memory and has to fake his way along with his own evil plan. And it's about second chances and the nature of evil and toxic masculinity and moat squid.
Awesome. So where did the idea for this book come from? Because it is a lot of fun.
So this is going to be one of those ones that people never actually want to read the books that are based off of, somebody's D&D campaign or whatever. But what had happened was my husband had planned a whole campaign that for one reason or another, we played one game of. And it involved evil wizard. Actually, just backing up a little bit, the opening scene of Dreadful is this guy wakes up in what is clearly an evil wizard's lair. It's got all of the trappings and things are on fire and he's missing his eyebrows and he cannot remember how he got here, but he knows he better get the heck out of here before the evil wizard gets back. And over the next few minutes, it slowly dawns on him that he is in fact the evil wizard. And he has no idea what he's doing. He has a castle full of goblin minions. He has a princess who he's apparently kidnapped and he has no idea why. And it turns out there are, in fact, other evil wizards that he is apparently working with. And he would very much like for them to not figure out that he is completely defenseless because he's pretty sure they will murder him. So this game started with that scenario of, hey, you wake up, you don't know what's going on, and you realize, you're an evil overlord. And stuff happened, life happened, we never finished it. And years later, it suddenly crosses my mind. I asked my husband, hey, so what did happen? Like, why did the guy lose his memory? And he's like, I have no idea. I don't remember. And it drove me crazy. And I just couldn't stop thinking about this guy. And how did he lose his memory? And what was he going to do? Would he ever get his memory back? And so since my husband couldn't tell me, I had to make it up.
Well, it was super, super fun. And I really enjoyed it and just sort of taking that journey with him. So this is a really interesting book. I think we talk a lot about like redemption arcs, especially in fantasy scenarios. And the thing about this is it's like, if you're technically not even sure who you are, do you get a redemption? Because as far as Gav, who is our evil, not evil wizard, his actual evil wizard name is
Gavrax.
Thank you, Gavrax. He isn't 100% sure who Gavrax was, and he's not sure he wants to know. And as you mentioned, he has this princess Eliasha who is trapped in a dungeon. Definitely not a good look for somebody. Nope. And he has all of these goblin minions who are actually like some of my favorite characters in the entire book. So
they were so fun. They were so fun to write. I love my goblins.
Yeah, they were wonderful. So I think one of my biggest questions is, were you finding out with Gav what the plan was? Or did you kind of have an idea what was going on when you sat down to write the book?
So I have a writing process that I find absolutely infuriating in that I cannot really get anywhere unless I've got a pretty good idea of where it's going. I usually outline pretty heavily. Going in, I knew basically how Gav had lost his memory. I knew basically what the overall plan had been. Some of it I sort of left as an exercise to myself when I got farther of like the exact details of precisely how some of the details worked. But I had a very strong idea of who he was going to interact with and what secrets each of them had. So I wrote the entire first draft, and those bits stayed. The how he lost his memory and what the overall goal was basically stayed the same. But once I had written it, then I ended up going back and having to change about the back third of the book because initially it came out significantly less funny. When I started the entire thing, I had pictured something very fun, and somewhere along the writing process, it started veering less fun and more serious, which is not a bad thing always. But when I got to the end, I was like, that wasn't actually the tone I was originally aiming for. So I ended up going back and significantly changing a chunk. Also, Eliasha used to be two different people. It was a princess, and then it was her illegitimate sister who had snuck in. Originally, Beetle was the valet role was her sister. And so it was the two of them playing off of each other. And as I got deeper into the book, poor Eliasha just stayed in that cell and never got out and didn't get to do a whole lot. And so I ended up going back and recombining them into a single character who had a lot more agency and got to do a lot more things. And again, like that hadn't been the initial plan. When I'd set it up, I had thought she was going to do a lot of things, and then somehow she just didn't. And I got to the end, I'm like, well, that's deeply unsatisfying. And unfortunately, I am finding that this is apparently how my subconscious likes to do things, because I absolutely had a very similar process with, I have another book that's going to be coming out next May that's called the Grimoire Grammar School Parent Teacher Association. And it had a regrettably similar writing process of I had the whole thing outlined and then got to the end and realized that I needed to make some substantial changes. But apparently that's just how my brain wants to work, whether I want it to work that way or not. And in the end, it comes out with a good book. So I get very annoyed with myself mid-book, but then it comes out okay in the end.
It's really always fun to listen to people talk about their writing process. It kind of, sometimes it just runs the gamut from people who really they have to outline very heavily and stick to it. And then there's people who are just the opposite. But the worlds that they live in Dreadful, how did that come together? Like the other evil wizards, the other players in the story. I mean, obviously now we know how Eliasha and her valet came together. First of all, I did really like Eliasha as a character. I was really happy that she did more than just sit in a cell.
Version 2
And
Eliasha was much more what she was originally intended to be.
yeah,
It needed some revisions to get her there.
yes. What about the others that inhabit the world? I mean, the goblins, I know you mentioned you love the goblins. I loved the goblins. Orla, I want to be besties with. How did they kind of fill in?
A lot of the main cast was fairly planned from the beginning, but a lot of the supporting cast kind of was a more organic process. I would create somebody to, because I would hit a point in a scene where I needed somebody to be able to do this thing. So I would stick somebody in, and then over time, I mean, I like to try to have a conservation of characters, and it's another thing I tend to not be great at on the first pass. I tend to introduce people and then not quite know what to do with them afterwards. So on one of the parts of the editing process is usually readjusting which scenes people are in and what some of the complexity of them are so that they continue to do interesting things across the narrative. So it was like, I started just with okay, he stumbled down to the kitchen And there's always that very stereotypical, like what things are suitable for evil villain to eat, which I find overlap very heavily with what things are suitable for toxic men on Twitter to eat, of what rules, like the rules that are around toxic masculinity are so restrictive. Like you see these guys sometimes where it's like, you cannot possibly do anything that could be construed as taking care of yourself, that eating anything other than apparently like mostly raw meat seems to be unmanly. There is very strict rules on which beverages you're allowed to have, or else you are unmanly. There's very strict rules about apparently carrying umbrellas is unmanly because being wet is manly. I don't get it. And that was one of the things I wanted to poke a lot of fun at. So I was like, this guy doesn't have a bunch of these preconceptions that his previous self apparently was very strict about maintaining. And so he's like looking at his plate and he's just like, oh, okay, this is a lot of beef. This is a lot of beef. Am I only allowed to eat beef? Can I have some salad? Salad is nice. And so I wanted somebody to play off of that, but I usually like try to give my minor characters, a rich inner life. And a lot of the themes of this book are around people making assumptions and also people having, and this is going to sound ridiculous for medieval fantasy, but people having a personal brand. I'm in marketing professionally, and I do spend a lot of time thinking about branding. And whether or not you are on social media constructing your personal brand, we all do have aspects of ourselves that we make public. And a lot of times we have different aspects of ourselves that we make public in different contexts. And one of the things that I had a lot of fun playing with in this book is that everyone in this world is very image conscious. This is a world where stereotypes have a lot of sway, which they do in our world too. And whether you play into the stereotypes or play against the stereotypes does affect how people treat you, which is also true in our world. And so one of the things, and I don't want to give too many details because there's a lot of spoilers here, but one of the things that I lean into a lot and have a lot of fun leaning into is that almost everybody you encounter has a facade that they're putting up. And some of them, it is very much themselves, but just carefully edited and managed to have an effect. And a good example of that is Velevna, who is an evil sorceress who is leaning into the sex appeal so hard because she knows what she's doing. She is extremely aware of the effects that she has on people with this very sultry kind of attitude. And she manipulates that both for power and also for her own amusement. Because again, like she is very upfront about being a very selfish person who is absolutely doing this for her own entertainment. Part of why she's so much fun. But she's very, very aware of every aspect of how she is perceived and how she can manipulate that to get what she wants out of the world. But every character is somewhat that. And many of them, as you get to know them, they have interesting hidden layers. They have dreams that are not necessarily safe to share, but they still want very desperately. They have backgrounds that, for one reason or another, they don't necessarily want everyone to know about because they're living in a world where sometimes that's dangerous. Sometimes it's just not a good way to get power or money or safety or whatever it is that they're looking for. And a lot of the fun of the book is slowly discovering who these people really are.
How did you come up with the names also?
I mean, again, with the branding thing, I figured anyone who is trying to inspire fear and be exotic and unknowable and everything. I mean, I'm playing a lot off of some of the standard fantasy naming tropes. So a lot of uncommon letters at the end of the alphabet. We have a lot of V's and Z's and X's because, again, I'm doing a lot of playing very lovingly because I love fantasy. I love fantasy. I've read so much fantasy and it's absolutely wonderful. But there's a lot of tropes that we can love, but we can also make fun of in a very loving way. And fantasy names often are almost unpronounceable. Especially our evil villains tend to be very exotic letters, names of things we don't use very often. And that's part of why Gav thinks of himself as Gav. He finds out that his name is Gavrax, and he's just like, that cannot possibly be my birth name. There's no way that parents are going to look at a baby, an adorable, little baby, and say, this guy's name is Gavrax. Maybe if there was like a great Uncle Gavrax that they were getting named for. So he figures that it probably is something that he made up so that it would sound sufficiently scary. And he's just like, I don't feel like that person. So he shortens it himself to Gav, and that's who he thinks of himself as. And increasingly, as he is realizing decisions that his past self has made, and the fact that he is not super happy with some of those decisions, he increasingly is thinking about Gavrax as an almost separate person.
Yeah, I liked that, especially when he encounters people who tell him things that Gavrax did in the future and things that they looked up to Gavrax for. And he's like, oh, why would you look up to anybody who would do
Yeah,
something like that?
he has toxic fanboys, and when he meets the kind of people who are fanboys of him and realize how abhorrent his own fanboys are, that definitely gives him some perspective on how much he wants to continue to be that kind of person.
So, without giving too much away, I felt like there might have been a slight door open to return to this world. Would you ever?
There is nothing currently on the books for it. That's not going to say that there will never be anything else in the world. I mean, I don't know whether I'll feel different at a different point, but at the moment, I kind of feel like Gav and Eliash's stories are closed. I mean, they're clearly going to go off and have other adventures, but they have had the character growth that I wanted to give them, and I don't currently have a whole lot else to say about them. The world itself at the moment, it's very much a stereotypical fantasy world, because that was a lot of what I'm doing, is playing with the tropes of other books. So there's parts of it that I very deliberately kept a little on the generic side, and that I will come back to it even when I have other things to say. I definitely liked a lot of the characters. I would be very happy to revisit some of the characters. Belevna's actually got her own short story that is in an anthology, Thrilling Adventure Tales 2023. One second, I've got it, or 2022. Sorry, I've got it on the shelf behind me. So if you want any more of Belevna, she's in Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2022. And there's also a free short story on my website that if you sign up for my newsletter, you get a free bonus story with Orla and the Mayor. I don't have any plans for a sequel, but I could definitely see other things in the universe. If so, it would probably have the current cast, some of them as like minor characters, but there isn't anybody specifically right now that I'm like, oh, this person, I want to tell more of their story. It would be more like another person in this universe who then runs into some of these characters again, and we see a little bit of like how far they've gotten. But as I said, right now, nothing's currently on the books. I do have another book coming out next spring, and I've got another one that's like 9 chapters in, but it's having a little issues. I'll work it out eventually. As I mentioned, I kind of fight my own process a bit here, but it always gets done in the end.
Thank you so much. Dreadful was super, super fun, and it's been doing really, really well.
It has. I absolutely credit the publicity team at Titan, who are just the most amazing people. They've gotten it into a bunch of places that I never would have dreamed that it was going to do this well. So they're just fantastic at their jobs and wonderful people. I've been so lucky working with the Titan team.
Well, I definitely look forward to your next book. Hopefully, we can chat about it.
I would love that.
All right. So this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest was
Caitlin Rozakis.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.